My name is Jonathan. I'm 42 years old, and I learned the hardest way possible that sometimes the person you build your entire life with is really just waiting for the right moment to tear it all down. This is the story of how I lost everything, how I was mocked at my lowest point, and how silence and patience became my greatest weapons in a game I never wanted to play. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, in a middle-class neighborhood where the rain fell more days than not, where the smell of coffee and pine trees mixed in the air, and where the Space Needle was visible from certain street corners, a constant reminder of ambition reaching toward gray skies. My father was a carpenter who built custom furniture in our garage workshop. The sound of his saw and the smell of fresh cut would defining my childhood. My mother was a librarian who believed that knowledge and hard work could take you anywhere. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable, consistent, and they taught me that success was something you built slowly, carefully, with your own two hands. I met Catherine when I was 25, fresh out of business school at the University of Washington, working my first real job as a junior analyst at a commercial real estate firm downtown. She was 23, working as a receptionist at a high-end salon in Belltown, and she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold, blue eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. We met at a friend's barbecue on a rare sunny Seattle afternoon, the kind of day when everyone floods to the parks and beaches because you never know when you'll see the sun again, and I was completely captivated from the first conversation. She came from a different background than mine. Her family had money, old Seattle money from timber and shipping, the kind of wealth that came with a certain pedigree and expectation. But Catherine had rebelled against all that, moved out at 18, cut herself off from her family's support to prove she could make it on her own. I admired that independence, that fire, that determination to be more than just her family name. We dated for 2 years, and I worked my way up at the firm, learning everything I could about commercial real estate, about property values and market trends, about the intricate dance of buying, developing, and selling buildings. When I proposed to her on a ferry crossing to Bainbridge Island, with Mount Rainier visible in the distance and the Puget Sound stretching out around us in shades of gray and blue, she said yes without hesitation. We got married in a small ceremony at a historic mansion in Capitol Hill, just family and close friends, and I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive. She looked like an angel in her simple white dress, and when she said her vows, promising to love me in good times and bad, for richer or poorer, I believed every word. The first few years were good. We rented a nice apartment in Queen and with a view of the city, worked hard at our respective jobs, spent weekends exploring the San Juan Islands or hiking in the Cascades when the weather permitted, which wasn't often given Seattle's perpetual drizzle. Catherine got promoted to salon manager, and I continued climbing the ladder at my firm, eventually becoming a senior analyst specializing in multifamily residential properties. We talked about buying a house, about starting a family, about building the life we'd always dreamed of. But I had a secret plan, something I was working on quietly in the background. I'd been saving aggressively, living well below our means despite our increasing income, and I'd been studying the real estate market with obsessive focus. I saw an opportunity that most people were missing. There was a neighborhood in Seattle just south of Capitol Hill that was on the verge of gentrification. Old buildings, mostly from the 1920s and 30s, that were undervalued and overlooked. I started buying small properties, using every penny I could scrape together, taking calculated risks that kept me awake at night. I didn't tell Catherine the full extent of what I was doing. I told her I was investing in real estate, which was true, but I downplayed the scale and the risk. I didn't want her to worry, and honestly, I wanted to surprise her when it all paid off. I wanted to be the man who could give her everything, who could prove that her faith in me wasn't misplaced. So I worked 2 jobs for a while, consulting on the side, putting every extra dollar into properties, renovating them slowly and carefully, learning to do much of the work myself the way my father had taught me. By the time I was 32, I owned 4 small apartment buildings. Nothing fancy, mostly older structures that needed work, but they were mine, and they were generating rental income that I immediately reinvested. Catherine knew I owned some properties, but she didn't know the details, didn't know how much time and money I was pouring into this venture. She was focused on her own career, which was flourishing. She'd left the salon and started working for a luxury real estate agency, selling high-end homes to wealthy clients, And she was good at it. Really good. Her commissions started exceeding my salary, and I was proud of her, genuinely proud. But something started to change. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. The way she'd mention how much she'd made on a sale, with a tone that suggested she was carrying us financially. The way she'd make comments about my little apartment buildings with a condescending smile, as if they were a hobby rather than a business. The way she started spending more time with her wealthy clients, going to exclusive events and parties, coming home later and later with stories about penthouses and waterfront estates that made our nice but modest apartment seem inadequate. When I was 35, Catherine reconnected with her family. Her father had gotten sick, and despite their estrangement, she went to visit him at their estate on Mercer Island, a sprawling property with manicured lawns and views of Lake Washington. When he recovered, instead of pulling away again, she stayed connected. Suddenly, we were attending family dinners at the estate, surrounded by Catherine's siblings and their successful spouses, all of them talking about their investments and vacation homes and private schools for their children. I felt out of place in my off-the-rack suit, listening to them discuss their stock portfolios and European vacations, while I was working 70-hour weeks managing properties and dealing with tenant issues and broken pipes. Catherine started changing. She wanted a bigger place, a house that reflected her success, her status. She wanted to move to Mercer Island, to be closer to her family. She started criticizing my work, suggesting that managing apartment buildings was beneath her, that I should be doing something more prestigious, more lucrative. She'd compare me to her brother-in-law who worked in tech and made 7 figures, or her sister's husband who was a successful surgeon. The woman who'd once admired my work ethic and ambition now seemed embarrassed by it. I tried to tell her about my long-term plan, about how the properties I was buying were appreciating, about how the neighborhood was transforming exactly as I'd predicted. But she wasn't interested in long-term plans. She wanted the lifestyle now, the house now, the status now. We started fighting more. Her voice sharp with disappointment, my voice defensive and tired. The apartment that had once felt cozy now felt suffocating, filled with tension and unspoken resentments. Then I met him. Bradley. He was one of Catherine's clients, a tech executive who'd sold his startup for an obscene amount of money and was looking for a showpiece property. Tall, handsome in that polished way that comes from expensive haircuts and personal trainers, always wearing designer clothes and driving a Tesla. Catherine brought him to a company party, introducing him as a major client, and I watched the way she laughed at his jokes, the way she touched his arm when she talked to him, the way her eyes lit up in a way they hadn't lit up for me in years. I'm not stupid. I saw what was happening. But I was so buried in work, so focused on building something that would secure our future, that I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I worked harder, thinking that if I could just get to the next level, if I could just prove my worth, things would get better. I bought 2 more buildings, stretching my finances to the absolute limit, taking risks that terrified me. I was 37 years old, managing 6 apartment buildings, working around the clock, and slowly watching my marriage disintegrate. The divorce came suddenly, though in retrospect I should have seen it coming. Catherine sat me down on a rainy Tuesday evening in March, the kind of relentless Seattle rain that feels like it will never stop, and told me she wanted out. She wasn't happy, hadn't been happy for years, felt like we'd grown apart, wanted different things. All the cliches that people use when they're leaving but don't want to admit the real reason. She didn't mention Bradley, but she didn't have to. I could see it in her eyes, the way she was already gone, already planning her next chapter that didn't include me. The divorce was brutal. Catherine hired an aggressive attorney, one of the best in Seattle, and went after everything. She wanted half of all assets, including the properties I'd bought and renovated and managed while she was building her career. She argued that her income had supported us during the years I was investing, that her success had enabled my investments, that she was entitled to half of everything I'd built. Her lawyer painted me as someone who'd been reckless with marital funds, who'd made risky investments without her full knowledge or consent, who'd prioritized buildings over his marriage. My lawyer advised me to fight, to argue that the properties were separate assets, that I'd used my own income and taken personal risks. But fighting would mean years of litigation, tens of thousands in legal fees, and the very real possibility of losing anyway. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and honestly, I just wanted it to be over. So I agreed to a settlement that gave Catherine a significant cash payout, enough to buy herself a beautiful house and maintain the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to. To pay her, I had to liquidate some assets, take out loans against my properties, and essentially drain every liquid resource I had. When the divorce was finalized, I was 40 years old, technically a property owner but cash poor, leveraged to the maximum, and starting over in every way that mattered. I had to move out of our apartment, which Catherine kept temporarily until she found her house. I had to find somewhere to live, but I couldn't afford much. Every dollar I had was tied up in properties or owed to the bank or paid to Catherine. So I did something that seemed crazy to everyone who knew me. I moved into a tiny studio apartment in one of my own buildings. The building was in that same neighborhood I'd been investing in for years, the one that was slowly gentrifying but still had rough edges. It was a 1930s structure, 4 stories, brick exterior weathered by decades of rain, small units that I rented mostly to students and young professionals. The studio I moved into was on the 3rd floor, barely 400 square feet, with a kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate and a mini fridge, a bathroom so small you could barely turn around, and a single window that looked out onto the alley behind the building. The radiator clanked and hissed, the hardwood floors were scratched and worn, and the whole place smelled faintly of the curry the family downstairs cooked every evening. It was humiliating. I'd gone from a nice apartment in Queen and to this tiny studio that was smaller than some people's closets. I'd gone from being a married man with prospects to a divorced guy living alone in a building that looked like it had seen better days. But it was all I could afford, and honestly, it was convenient. I could manage the building more easily if I lived there, could respond to tenant issues immediately, could save on rent by living in a unit that had been vacant anyway. The day I moved in was gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that matched my mood perfectly. I didn't have much to move, just some clothes, my laptop, a few books, and a mattress I'd bought off Craigslist. I was carrying boxes up the narrow stairwell, the walls painted a dingy beige that probably hadn't been updated since the 80s, when I heard a voice behind me that made my blood run cold. "Jonathan? Is that really you?" I turned around and there she was, Catherine, standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking immaculate in designer jeans and a leather jacket that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the rain. And next to her, with his hand possessively on her lower back, was Bradley, looking smug in his expensive casual wear. "Catherine," I said, my voice flat, "what are you doing here?" "We were just driving through the neighborhood," she said, and I could hear the barely suppressed amusement in her voice. "Bradley's thinking about investing in some properties around here, and I told him I knew someone who owned buildings in the area. I didn't realize you'd moved. Is this where you're living now?" She looked past me up the stairs, taking in the dingy hallway, the worn carpet, the flickering fluorescent light, and then she laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine laugh of disbelief and something that sounded uncomfortably like satisfaction. "Oh my God, Jonathan. A studio? You're living in a studio apartment? In this building?" She looked at Bradley, who was trying to hide his own smirk. "This is one of his buildings. He owns this place, and he's living in a studio that's probably smaller than our walk-in closet." "Our closet," I noted, the words tasting bitter. They were already living together, already playing house, probably in some beautiful home that my settlement money had helped purchase. "Well, you know what I mean," Catherine said, waving her hand dismissively. "I just can't believe this is what you've been reduced to. All those years of working yourself to death, buying these rundown buildings, and this is where you end up? Living like a college student at 40 years old." Bradley finally spoke, his voice carrying that particular condescension that comes from people who've never had to struggle. "No offense, man, but maybe you should have focused more on liquid assets. Real estate is great, but if you can't afford to live in a decent place yourself, what's the point?" I stood there on those stairs, holding a box of my belongings, looking at my ex-wife and her wealthy boyfriend, and felt humiliation wash over me like the rain that was falling outside. They were right, in a way. Here I was, a property owner, living in a tiny studio that most people would consider a step backward. I looked poor. I looked like I'd failed. I looked like exactly what Catherine had always feared I'd become. ordinary, struggling beneath her. "I'm doing fine," I said, my voice tight. "This is temporary." "Sure it is," Catherine said, and her smile was pitying. "Well, we should let you get back to moving in. Come on, Bradley, I don't think this neighborhood is quite what you're looking for. Let's go look at those lofts in Capitol Hill instead." They left, Catherine's laughter echoing in the stairwell, and I stood there feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. I finished moving my boxes, set up my tiny studio, and sat on my Craigslist mattress looking around at my new reality. 400 square feet, worn floors, a view of an alley, and the knowledge that my ex-wife was out there telling everyone how far I'd fallen. What Catherine didn't know, what I hadn't told her during the divorce because my lawyer had advised me to keep certain things quiet, what Bradley with his smug smile couldn't have guessed, was that this building she just mocked wasn't my only property. It wasn't even my most valuable property. Over the past 15 years, while Catherine was focused on her career and her wealthy clients and eventually her affair, I'd been quietly, methodically, building an empire. I didn't just own this building. I owned the building next door, and the one next to that. I owned an entire block of properties in this neighborhood that Catherine had dismissed as beneath her. 8 buildings in total, 64 units, all of them in an area that had been appreciating at 15% per year for the past 5 years. The neighborhood that had been rough around the edges when I started buying was now being featured in Seattle Magazine as the next hot area, with new restaurants and coffee shops and boutiques opening every month, with young professionals and families moving in, with property values skyrocketing. The tiny studio I was living in, that was strategic. I'd moved there to save money, yes, but also because I was in the middle of the biggest project of my life. I was renovating the entire block, building by building, unit by unit, transforming these old structures into modern, desirable apartments while maintaining their historic character. I was doing much of the work myself on weekends, just like my father had taught me, saving money on contractors and learning every inch of my properties. I lived in the studio because it was convenient, because it kept me close to the work, and because every dollar I saved on rent was a dollar I could invest in the renovations. But more than that, I just closed on the biggest deal of my career. A developer had approached me about buying the entire block, all 8 buildings, for a price that was almost obscene. They wanted to turn the ground floors into retail space and upscale the apartments, and they were willing to pay premium prices for the location and the potential. I'd been negotiating for 6 months, and we'd finally reached an agreement. The sale would close in 90 days, and when it did, I'd walk away with enough money to never have to worry about finances again. I could have told Catherine all of this during the divorce. I could have disclosed the full extent of my holdings, the appreciation of the properties, the pending deal. But my lawyer had advised me that the properties were legitimately separate assets, acquired before and during the marriage with my own income and risk, and that the settlement we'd agreed to was fair based on what Catherine knew and could prove. Telling her about the potential sale would have complicated everything, extended the litigation, and possibly cost me millions in additional settlement. So I'd stayed quiet. I'd let her think I was struggling, let her believe she'd gotten the better end of the deal, let her walk away with her cash settlement while I kept the properties she'd always dismissed as little apartment buildings. And now, 3 months after the divorce was finalized, she'd shown up to mock me at what she thought was my lowest point, not knowing that I was actually at the beginning of my greatest success. I didn't tell anyone about the pending sale. Not my family, not my friends, not the tenants in my buildings. I just kept working, kept renovating, kept managing the properties and living in my tiny studio. I showed up to tenant meetings in jeans and work boots, fixed leaky faucets myself, painted hallways, replaced light fixtures. I looked like exactly what Catherine had accused me of being, a small-time landlord barely scraping by. But every night, I'd sit in my studio and review the sale documents, look at the numbers, plan my next moves. I wasn't doing this for revenge exactly. I was doing it because it was the smart play, because staying quiet and humble and under the radar had always been my strategy. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about Catherine's laugh in that stairwell, about Bradley's condescending smile, about the way they'd looked at me like I was a failure. The neighborhood continued to transform around me. A high-end coffee roaster opened on the corner. A farm-to-table restaurant took over the old hardware store. A boutique fitness studio moved in across the street. Property values kept climbing, and my buildings, with their fresh renovations and historic charm, became increasingly desirable. I raised rents modestly as leases renewed, always staying below market rate because I didn't need to maximize income anymore. I just needed to maintain value until the sale closed. I heard through mutual friends that Catherine and Bradley had bought a house on Mercer Island, a modern mansion with lake views and a dock, the kind of place that gets featured in luxury real estate magazines. I heard they were engaged, planning a wedding at some exclusive venue. I heard Catherine was telling people that divorcing me was the best decision she'd ever made, that she'd been held back by my lack of ambition, that she was finally living the life she deserved. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't defend myself. I just kept working, kept living in my studio, kept waiting for the sale to close. 90 days felt like forever, but I'd learned patience over the years. I'd learned that success isn't always loud and obvious, that sometimes the best victories are the quiet ones that nobody sees coming. Then, 60 days after Catherine had laughed at me in the stairwell, I got a call from Bradley. He wanted to meet, said he had a business proposition. I was surprised but curious, so I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, neutral territory. He showed up looking as polished as ever, ordered an expensive espresso, and got straight to the point. He'd been looking at investment properties in Seattle, and he'd heard through the real estate grapevine that my block was being sold to a developer. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to sell to him instead. Said he'd match any offer. Said he saw the potential in the area and wanted to get in on the ground floor. I sipped my regular drip coffee and looked at him across the table. The sale is already in progress, I said. Contracts are signed. We're just waiting for closing. Contracts can be broken, Bradley said with the confidence of someone who'd always been able to buy his way into or out of anything. I'm prepared to offer you 10% above whatever they're paying. Cash, quick close, no complications. How much do you think they're paying? I asked, genuinely curious about what he thought my properties were worth. He named a figure that was about half of the actual sale price. A respectable number, certainly more than Catherine probably thought the buildings were worth, but nowhere near their true value. I smiled, and it must have been a strange smile because Bradley's confident expression faltered slightly. The actual sale price is double what you just said, I told him. And even if you could match it, which I doubt, I wouldn't sell to you. The deal is done. Bradley's face went through several expressions. Disbelief, calculation, and finally something like respect mixed with resentment. Catherine said you were barely getting by, he said slowly. She said you were living in a studio, struggling to manage a few rundown buildings. I am living in a studio, I confirmed, in one of the 8 buildings I own on that block. Buildings that are about to make me wealthier than you and Catherine combined, I'd guess. But she didn't know that because she never really paid attention to what I was building. She just saw what she wanted to see. I stood up, leaving my coffee half-finished. Tell Catherine I said congratulations on the engagement. I hope that house on Mercer Island is everything she wanted. And Bradley? Next time you're looking at investment properties, maybe do your due diligence before you assume someone's struggling just because they're not flashing their wealth around. I walked out of that coffee shop feeling lighter than I'd felt in years. The closing date was 30 days away, and I started making plans. I'd keep 2 of the buildings, the ones in the best condition, as long-term investments. The rental income alone would be substantial. The rest of the money I'd invest carefully, diversify, set myself up for life. I'd move out of the studio, find a nice place, nothing ostentatious but comfortable. Maybe a condo with a view of the Sound, or a small house in one of the neighborhoods I'd always liked. But first, I had one more thing to do. I planned a tenant meeting for all 8 buildings, something I did quarterly to address concerns and share updates. I scheduled it for the week before closing, in the community room of the largest building, and I made sure to mention that I had important news to share about the future of the properties. The room was packed, about 40 tenants showing up, people who'd been living in my buildings for years, who'd watched me fix their sinks and shovel snow and repaint hallways. They knew me as Jonathan the landlord, the guy who lived in a studio just like many of them, who was always available when something broke, who kept rents reasonable even as the neighborhood got more expensive. I stood at the front of the room in my usual jeans and flannel shirt, and I told them the truth. I told them about the sale, about the developer who was buying the block, about the plans to renovate and upscale. I told them that their leases would be honored, that the new owners were committed to working with existing tenants, that nobody would be displaced without proper notice and assistance. I saw the worry on their faces, the fear that comes with change and uncertainty, and I did my best to reassure them. And then I told them something else. I told them that I'd negotiated a clause in the sale contract that protected long-term tenants, that limited rent increases for existing residents, that ensured the character of the community would be preserved even as the buildings were improved. I told them that I'd fought for them in the negotiations because they'd been good tenants, because this was their home, because I remembered what it was like to struggle and worry about rent. The room was quiet for a moment, and then one of my tenants, a graduate student who'd lived in the building for 3 years, started clapping. Others joined in, and suddenly the whole room was applauding, and people were coming up to shake my hand and thank me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride that had nothing to do with money or success, but with doing right by people who trusted me. The closing happened on a rainy Thursday morning, appropriately enough for Seattle. I sat in a conference room in a downtown high-rise, surrounded by lawyers and real estate agents and the developers who were buying my properties, and I signed document after document. When it was done, when the wire transfer was confirmed and the properties officially changed hands, I walked out of that building a wealthy man by any definition. I didn't celebrate loudly. I didn't buy a sports car or throw a party or post about it on social media. I had a nice dinner alone at one of my favorite restaurants, a quiet place with good food and no pretension, and I toasted my father's memory, wishing he could have seen what his lessons about patience and craftsmanship had built. The news spread quickly through Seattle's real estate community. The sale was public record, and the price was substantial enough to be noteworthy. Within a week, I started getting calls from former colleagues, from investors wanting to partner on new deals, from reporters wanting to interview me about my success story. I declined most of them, accepted a few, and generally tried to maintain the low profile I'd always preferred. I knew it was only a matter of time before Catherine found out. I wondered how she'd react, whether she'd be angry or regretful, or if she'd try to claim she'd always known I'd be successful. I didn't have to wonder long. She called me 3 weeks after the closing, her voice tight and controlled in a way that told me she was furious but trying to hide it. She wanted to meet, said we needed to talk, said there were some things about the divorce settlement that needed to be revisited. I agreed to meet her, curious about what she'd say, how she'd try to spin this. We met at a Starbucks near her office, neutral and public. She showed up looking perfect as always, but I could see the tension around her eyes, the tightness in her smile. We got our coffees and sat down, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You lied to me," she said, her voice low and accusatory. "During the divorce, you lied about your assets. You hid the true value of those properties. That's fraud, Jonathan. I could take you back to court." "I didn't lie," I said calmly. "I disclosed all my properties, exactly as required. The valuations were accurate at the time of the divorce. The fact that I sold them afterward for more than they were worth during our marriage isn't fraud. It's good business." "You knew," she insisted. "You knew they were worth more. You knew about the development potential. You hid that from me." "I had projections and hopes," I corrected, "just like I'd had for 15 years while I was building that portfolio." "You never cared about those projections, Catherine. You called them my little apartment buildings and dismissed them as a waste of time. You wanted liquid cash, and I gave you a generous settlement. You can't come back now because you realize you underestimated what I was building." Her perfect composure cracked slightly. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Everyone knows now. Everyone knows that I divorced you right before you became wealthy. They're all talking about it, saying I made a mistake, saying I left too soon. Is that what bothers you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Not that we're not together, but that people are talking? Of course that's what bothers me," she snapped, then caught herself, lowering her voice. "I look like an idiot, Jonathan. I look like the woman who couldn't see what she had, who traded a diamond for fool's gold." "You traded me for Bradley," I said quietly. "A man who has money now but didn't build anything, who inherited and lucked into wealth rather than creating it. You chose flash over substance, Catherine. That was your choice, and you don't get to regret it now just because the substance turned out to be more valuable than you thought. She stared at me, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been regret, or might have just been wounded pride. I did love you once, she said softly, before everything got complicated. I know, I said, and I meant it. I loved you too. But you stopped loving the man I actually was and started resenting me for not being someone else. You wanted me to be like your family, like Bradley, like all those wealthy people you admired. You never appreciated that I was building something real, something that would last. You just wanted the results without respecting the process. So what now? She asked. You're rich, I'm engaged to someone else, and we just move on like none of this happened? That's exactly what we do, I said. You have your life, I have mine. You got what you wanted in the divorce, and I got to keep what I built. It's done, Catherine. Let it be done. She left without finishing her coffee, and I sat there for a while, watching the rain streak down the windows, feeling a strange sense of closure. I didn't hate her, didn't even really resent her anymore. She'd made her choices based on what she valued, and I'd made mine. The fact that my choices had paid off better than hers wasn't my fault or my problem. I moved out of the studio apartment a month later, into a beautiful two-bedroom condo in Belltown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Elliott Bay. It wasn't ostentatious, wasn't the biggest or most expensive place I could afford, but it was comfortable and it was mine. I furnished it simply, hung some of my father's handmade furniture that I'd kept in storage, and created a space that felt like home. I started a new venture, investing in affordable housing projects, using my experience and capital to create quality apartments for working families, the kind of people who'd been my tenants, who needed someone who understood that housing wasn't just an investment but a fundamental human need. It was profitable but also meaningful, and I found more satisfaction in it than I'd found in anything else I'd done. I heard through the grapevine that Catherine and Bradley's engagement had ended, that he'd been caught having an affair with someone else, that Catherine had moved out of the Mercer Island house and was living in a condo downtown. I felt a twinge of sympathy but didn't reach out. That chapter was closed, and we both needed to move forward. A year after the sale, I was at a charity gala for a housing nonprofit I'd started supporting, wearing a tux that actually fit properly for once, when I literally bumped into someone at the bar. She was an architect named Sarah, working on sustainable housing projects, and we started talking about building design and community development, and somehow ended up in a 3-hour conversation that ranged from zoning laws to our favorite hiking trails in the Cascades. She was brilliant and passionate and completely unimpressed by wealth for its own sake, more interested in what you did with resources than how much you had. We started dating, slowly and carefully, both of us carrying baggage from previous relationships but willing to try. She loved that I'd lived in a studio apartment while owning the building, thought it showed character and practicality rather than failure. She understood that real success wasn't about appearances but about building something meaningful. 2 years after my divorce, I was happier than I'd been in decades. I had meaningful work, a woman I was falling in love with who valued the same things I did, and the financial security to pursue projects that mattered rather than just projects that paid. I'd learned that the people who mock you at what they think is your lowest point are usually the people who never understood your journey in the first place. Catherine had laughed when she saw me moving into that tiny studio, had assumed I'd failed, had felt vindicated in her decision to leave. She didn't know I owned the entire building, didn't know about the 7 other buildings, didn't know about the deal that was about to change everything. She saw what she expected to see, a struggling ex-husband who'd proven her right. But success isn't always visible from the outside. Sometimes it's quiet and patient, built slowly over years of work that other people dismiss or ignore. Sometimes it's living in a studio apartment while you own the building, sacrificing comfort for strategy, accepting mockery because you know something others don't. The greatest victory wasn't the money, though that certainly didn't hurt. The greatest victory was proving to myself that I'd been right all along, that the path I'd chosen was valid, that patience and hard work and strategic thinking could build something real and lasting. Catherine got her mansion and her status and her wealthy boyfriend, and she still ended up unhappy. I got my tiny studio and my rundown buildings and my quiet strategy, and I ended up with everything I actually needed. Sometimes the person laughing at you doesn't realize they're standing in your building, mocking your success because they can't see past the surface. And sometimes the best response is no response at all, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that time will reveal the truth, and that success speaks loudest when it doesn't need to speak at all. I never told Catherine that I'd heard her laughing in that stairwell, that I'd seen the satisfaction in her eyes when she thought I'd failed. I never told her that her mockery had actually strengthened my resolve, had reminded me why I'd chosen the path I'd chosen. I just let her find out the truth the same way everyone else did, through public records and real estate news and the gossip that spreads through Seattle's tight-knit professional community. And when I think back to that rainy day, carrying boxes up those stairs to my tiny studio, hearing her laugh echo in the stairwell, I smile, because she was standing in my building, mocking my life, completely unaware that she was literally surrounded by my success. She just couldn't see it because it didn't look the way she expected success to look. That's the thing about building something real. It doesn't always look impressive from the outside. Sometimes it looks like a rundown building in a transitional neighborhood. Sometimes it looks like a 40-year-old man living in a studio apartment. Sometimes it looks like failure to people who only understand success in terms of appearances and status symbols. But underneath the surface, beneath the modest exterior, there's a foundation built to last. There's strategy and patience and years of work that nobody saw. There's value that doesn't need to be displayed because it's real and solid and undeniable. My ex-wife laughed as I moved into a tiny studio. She didn't know I owned the entire building. But more than that, she didn't know I owned the block, didn't know about the deal, didn't know that her mockery was happening in the middle of my greatest success. She couldn't see it because she'd never really seen me, had never understood what I was building or why. And that's fine. Some people will never understand that success isn't always loud, that wealth isn't always visible, that the person they're dismissing might be standing on a foundation they can't see. I learned to be okay with that, to find satisfaction in the work itself rather than in other people's recognition or approval. I built something real, something that lasted, something that provided homes for families and security for my future and meaning for my life. I did it quietly, patiently, without flash or fanfare. And when the moment came to reveal what I'd built, I didn't have to say a word. The truth spoke for itself, louder than any explanation or defense ever could. That's the best kind of success. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself, that doesn't require validation, that simply exists as an undeniable fact. My ex-wife laughed at what she thought was my failure, standing in the middle of my success, and the irony was so perfect I couldn't have planned it better if I'd tried. I owned the building. I always did. She just never bothered to look past the surface to see what was really there. And by the time she realized her mistake, I'd already moved on to building something even better.